Psychoanalysis and philosophy. Our subject today is reductionism, emergence, and the practice of psychoanalysis. Our subject brings philosophy as it is implicitly effective in the practice of psychoanalysis. Philosophy of psychoanalysis is not something that is talked about liberally in psychoanalysis. In recent times, those who have been trained in psychoanalysis don't get a deeper foundation in the philosophy of psychoanalysis or philosophy and psychoanalysis in general. This creates an impression in the minds of practitioners and students that psychoanalysis is almost like a philosophical enterprise, a scientific enterprise without any philosophical foundation or bias. It also takes away the creative possibilities of pluralism, which would come up if we bring the philosophical foundation as it affects the practice and as it affects the conceptual development of the area into discussion. So today we will get into that area, psychoanalysis and philosophy, and how the philosophical foundations, mostly implicit not in a very innocent way, but implicit as a ideological weapon. And once we bring into transparency and discussion this ideological underpinnings, alternative possibilities emerge. Possibilities very creative and very precious. Let us get into the subject today. Reductionism. Our subject today is reductionism, emergence, and the practice of psychoanalysis. Let us first understand the two words, reductionism and emergence, in their scientific context, philosophical context, and then bring that discussion into the practice of psychoanalysis, if necessary, even into the conceptual foundations of psychoanalysis. Western science, ever since the Greek civilization, is based upon two unsaid ideological principles. The unsaid ideological principles are materialism and reductionism. Reductionism is still easy to accept. Materialism is even more difficult to accept. But these two pillars are the pillars of Western scientific and philosophical thought for the last 5,000 years. Reductionism and materialism. What does reductionism mean? Reductionism means that from matter has come life, from life has come mind, and therefore to understand mind, we have to understand life, and to understand life, we have to understand matter, and to understand matter, we have to understand the constituents of matter, which are the molecules. To understand the molecules, we have to understand the atom. To understand the atom, we have to understand the subatomic particles. And to understand them, we have to ultimately understand those elementals from which the entire matter and from their life and from their mind emerges. So it is explaining the whole system by understanding the elementals that constitute the system. And the idea there is on the lines of what we find in the world of colors. In the world of colors, we say there are three primary colors: red, blue, and green. And all other colors are combinations of these three primary colors. So the millions and millions of colors that we see are essentially combinations of three elemental colors. And this is the very model of explaining the system by elementals, that you may have millions of colors, but essentially there are only three elemental colors which combine in different proportions to create the millions of colors. The same is true in reductionism, that we have to understand a few elemental constituents of matter, and from there we can explain the atom, from atom the molecule, from molecule life, from life mind. And the assumption is that in the ultimate analysis, mind is not something different from life. Life is not something different from matter. And there are no emergent principles involved. It is just that because it is too complex, we are not able to explain it. But the reality as it stands is that in the ultimate analysis, the mind completely can be explained in terms of the subatomic particles. And this is the ambition, great ambition of reductionism, that all the observable phenomena in the universe can be explained in terms of elemental particles. So this is what is called reductionism. And the arrow of causality here is always inside out. That from the elemental particles, it goes to more macro particles, to macro systems, to life, to mind. It's all inside out. We don't go into the question of how something from outside can influence elemental particles. So that is not allowed here. The prospect that something from outside the system of elementals can influence the elemental. What is also not allowed are the concepts of free will. Free will cannot act in any way upon the elemental particles. Concepts like luck, grace, accidents also cannot influence the elemental particles in any way. So we are talking of an absolutely rational universe, absolutely mechanical universe, absolutely elemental particle determined universe. So this is the march of reductionism which is going on. The difficulty is, how do we account for issues like free will, issues like effect of history, effect of politics, effect of entire social science on the mind of the individual in this kind of perspective? So how do we account for any outside in effect of force upon the elemental particles? And how do greater systems affect the smaller systems? Because if Earth is impacted by events of the solar system, and what happens at macro level in Earth, atmosphere affects all parts and thereby affects the way life exists, and thereby the evolution and how the mind exists. One of the difficulties of reductionism also is evolution. It's a half difficulty, not a full difficulty, because evolution brings in the concept of purpose, the concept of design. And the difficulty then is How do we reconcile? How do we reconcile the concept of design and the concept of purpose with the majesty of elemental particles? One way out is to say the elemental particles have the blueprint of evolution. Elemental particles are purposeful. So we can still have reductionism with purpose, reductionism with design. But usually it is difficult because then the whole question of purpose acting out in human history comes up. And that makes elemental determinism even more difficult to explain. The whole effect of something outside the elemental system, even if we take away concepts of free will, God, grace, luck, history, all the social sciences, all the human endeavors, even then, even from a strictly physical point of view, reductionism can have a limit. And Leonard Susskind, a physicist, says it very well. He says the march of reductionism will go to the level of Planck scale and then it will reverse. And then we will see effect of larger systems outside the elemental system we are studying on the elemental particles that constitute the elemental system. And this march, when it reverses, the march of reductionism, when it reverses at the Planck scale, some will say much before the Planck scale, some will say lower than Planck scale, but at whatever level the march reverses, that is where the holism will start to come in to the reductionist science, and the reductionist science will start balancing itself out with holistic thinking. But that is for the future. Till now and for the present, what we see is reductionism as a ambitious enterprise of Western science, right from the Greeks down to us. This in psychoanalysis was also seen in thinking of many psychoanalysts, especially Freud. So if we look at the traditional line of psychoanalytic thinkers, Freud, Klein, Bion, we see the same foundations implicitly accepted by these thinkers. Freud's endeavor of the project is a very good example of reductionism. How to explain the whole of psychoanalysis and anchor it into the neurobiology. The difficulty is psychoanalysis has never been able to reach there, and the most elemental concepts to which psychoanalysis has been able to reduce itself are the concepts of the survival of the self and the survival of the species. And to that has been added the concept of pleasure. And thereafter evolution, and thereafter in later Freud, the concept of self-destruction. And the self-destruction has two aspects, as Freud saw in the Second World War, a pathological self-destruction, the working of the death instinct, the working of masochism, the working of pain in pleasure, the juisa, and the second is a self-destruction which is sublimated, a sublimated masochism, a sublimated self-sacrifice, which one sees in sacrifices people make for a higher cause. The cause can be somebody near to them, or the cause can be an ideology or religion. But what we saw in the evolution of psychoanalysis is it was not possible to explain the whole of human mind by reducing it to two elementals of survival of the self and survival of the species. We have to add other elementals of pleasure, evolution, self-destruction. And Adler would say we also have to add the elemental of power. Maslow would say we have to add the elemental of self-actualization. So, despite best efforts, psychoanalysis was not able to reduce itself to two elementals. It became a multi-elemental system. So the reduction happened, but reduction could not happen very strongly into one or two elementals. It happened on 4 to 5 elementals. And if we take the Hindu psycho-spirituality, then we go into the system of the chakras, and in each chakra we see one or two elementals. These elementals, according to the Hindu spirituality, are fundamental elementals in the psychological system, which cannot be reduced to anything other than themselves. They are fundamental facts of nature in the psychological realm. And according to Hindu spirituality, the material realm, the life realm, the psychological realm, and the spiritual realm have their own elementals, which cannot be reduced to anything other than themselves. So it's a far more plural and far more multi-elemental system of explaining human mind and reality compared to psychoanalysis. So if you look at the reductionism in psychoanalysis and reductionism in Hindu spirituality, the reductionism in psychoanalysis is very strong and steep into a few elementals, 4 to 5. In Hindu spirituality, we are looking at 15 to 25 different elementals. So this is one element of reductionism as it is going in psychoanalysis and other systems of psychology. There is another element. As we said, we believe that somewhere reductionism will reverse the march and it will turn up to engage with systems from outside. So the outside in influence on the fundamental elementals, the constituent elementals of the elemental system, that will come in. In psychoanalysis, parallel to this is how society comes into psychoanalysis, how history comes into psychoanalysis, how intergenerationality comes into psychoanalysis. So these are things which come from outside the individual's conscious and the unconscious to influence the individual's conscious and the unconscious. So the inside out is complemented by outside in. And in classical psychoanalysis of the Freud client beyond years, the outside in was not yet factored in. It was all inside out. Not that outside in was not accepted, but it was not conceptually theorized. The theory was not developed enough to really factor in the outside in. It was too complicated to factor in at that point because the intrapsychic phenomena themselves were so complicated that we were struggling to understand it, which even today we struggle to understand. We are nowhere near to a certain understanding of the intrapsychic phenomena. And to add to the complexity are outside in forces. So that was kept for the later, and rightly so. Today that later has become present, and we talk about outside in influences on the human mind and the human unconscious. And the outside in has been coming into psychoanalysis. It's almost like the reductionism, even before reaching the elementals, has reversed itself, or rather outside in forces have started to be factored in even as we are moving on in the reductionist march. Nothing wrong in the reductionist march. It is after all a march of knowledge, limited but very useful, very precise, very exact, very empirical, very scientific. So if we look into psychoanalysis, then apart from this reductionist march, we had Alfred Adler bringing in society the element of power. We had some Marxist theoreticians trying to bring in society and history into psychoanalysis. And Lacan recently has brought in the big other in a very distinct way, where outside in forces get factored in the way the mind operates. And once we factor it in the way the mind operates, the natural outflow of that acceptance will be on pathogenesis, and from there on to the healing plan, the healing technique. The second element of the non-reductionist influence in psychoanalysis comes from Kohut. Kohut brought in the element of culture when he looked at, on a larger social scale, what is the kind of pathology that Freud was looking at, and what is the kind of pathology he is encountering in his practice. Kohut used two terms, the tragic man and the guilty man. He said the type of patients that would come for psychoanalysis in Freud's time essentially were what he calls the guilty man. The group of patients where there is essentially a drive frustration conflict. That the drive is frustrated because of pressure of reality and morality. There again, if we look into it, society comes in. So in that sense, implicit, although Freud did not recognize it, in the frustration that we talk about in the drive frustration model, society does come in. The outside in does come in. But it was not factored in conceptually by Freud. Kohut conceptualizes about it. He says, sorry. Kohut talks about the tragic man and the guilty man. Tragic man is the group that comes to Kohut. And this is the group which has mirroring idealization failures. It is a pathology rooted more in object relations of object loss or encounter with a bad object rather than strictly of a drive frustration. And Kohut calls this the pathology of the self. And he says the type of patients he sees are very different from the type of patients Freud used to see. On a larger public health angle, this culture today plays out in terms of widespread appearance of personality disorders. Personality disorders have become so rampant, it's almost become second nature for most people. And there is a public health aspect to it as to how culture of society and the material conditions and the political conditions of society, they impact psychopathology, generation as well as cure. Another element which opposes this reductionist march of psychoanalysis comes from transpersonal elements. Transpersonal elements in psychoanalysis come from Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. Some psychoanalysts are now working with the concept of reincarnation, and some are working with issues which are strictly parapsychological. Some are also working with psychedelics. So this transpersonal element coming into psychoanalysis through the concepts of collective unconscious, reincarnation, parapsychological studies, and psychedelic studies, they are I should not say opposed to, but complementing the reductionist march. Psychoanalysis essentially is rooted in a Abrahamical flavor of singularism, individualism, hedonism, and materialism. The only point at which psychoanalysis differs from Abrahamical religions is on the point of materialism. Otherwise, it shares the singularism, the individualism, and hedonism implicit in Abrahamical thinking. Therefore, when we look at model of the mind in psychoanalysis, be it Freud's models or Jung's model, the model of the mind essentially is based on the reductionist assumption. Jung's model is not based on reductionist assumption. It brings in the transpersonal concept of collective unconscious, but Freud's models definitely are rooted in reductionism. Client's beyond thinking also is rooted in reductionism implicitly, although they don't deal so much with philosophy. And if we go into the Hindu spirituality and the psychospirituality of Hinduism, we see the model of the mind is far more holistic. Not only it is more multi-elemental, not only at all the 3-4 levels of reality, matter, in fact the 5 levels, matter, energy, emotion, thought, and spirituality, at all the 5 levels, we have a set of elementals which cannot be reduced to anything other than themselves. So it's a far more plural and far more multi-zone, multi-elemental model. And these models of the mind are such where the individual is in exchange with reality. Not only in terms of transpersonal, not only in terms of culture, economics, religion, and history, but also in a larger sense of in exchange with the universe. So it's a far more holistic and far more multi-zone, multi-elemental model of the mind, and thereby the pathogenesis becomes different and the healing technique also becomes different. So the model of the mind and the model of the reality both are different in Hindu psychospirituality, very different from psychoanalysis. And when we look at the model of the mind in Hindu psychospirituality, we see both the inside out and outside in getting explained. Some models in the Hindu psychospirituality area are the model of Tantra, the model of yoga, the Sri Aurobindo's model of the mind, and combining the psychoanalytic models of the mind and the Eastern models of the mind, I have created a heat model of the mind, which also tries to take one step forward in conceptualization. So we see the reductionism at work in psychoanalysis, the nature of reductionism, and how non-reductionist inputs are complementing it. Let us now come to the concept of emergence. What is emergence? The first conceptual shortcoming of, not shortcoming, but conceptual limitation of reductionism would be emergence. The idea of emergence is that if two elemental entities combine, it can create a third entity which is completely different from the two combining entities. Take for example, common salt, sodium chloride. Sodium and chlorine, both of which are difficult for human health, they combine to form sodium chloride, which is essential for human health. So the moment two elements combine, the resultant element has completely different properties. And this is an example of emergence, where the emerging properties of a combination is very different from the properties of the elementals which constitute it, which means it's very difficult to explain the aggregate system from the characteristics of its constituents. Now, if we take this phenomena of emergence, which is a difficult phenomena for reductionism to handle, we can see emergence in various ways. There are emergent properties. Two entities come together and the third resultant entity has completely different properties, which we see in case of common salt. Emergence of materials. Two simple materials, soft materials, can come together in unique ways to create a very hard material. Emergence of materials with different characteristics. Emergent phenomena like matter coming together and life emerging out of it, proteins emerging for the first time out of it. This is called emergence. There is a phenomena of life which emerges out of phenomena of matter. And therefore, this whole area of emergence is divided into two. Small emergence and big emergence. Small emergence would be emergence of properties like sodium chloride. And big emergence would be emergence of life out of matter, of mind out of life, or emergence of a material very precious and completely out of this world from very ordinary materials. If we try to explain emergence, there are certain ways of explaining it. Strict reductionists would say there is nothing like emergence. It is still a play of elementals. It is just that we don't know. And someday we will explain. So we don't know, but reductionism is true. That is one defense of reductionism. Second is that emergence is an elemental characteristic of nature. That emergence is there. The resultant cannot be explained by studying the elementals because emergence is a distinct phenomena in nature. And therefore, reductionism has limitations. We have zone-wise reductionism, that in the zone of matter, a certain kind of reductionism works. In the zone of life, certain kind of reductionism works. So we are looking at range-bound reductionism and multi-reductionism. Multi-zone reductionism. So we look at R1, R2, R3, three different kinds of reductionisms with emergence in between, which cannot be explained in terms of reductionism. So we have R1, R2, R3, and E1, E2, E3, 6 different entities at work in a very fundamental way. And then the question would be, if we put a philosophical question, why is reductionism there, or why should reductionism be the correct explanation? And that can be applied to anything. Why is X there? Whatever causality we find, why is that causality there? And what is the purpose of that causality and who has put it there? And of course, those questions don't have answer either in reductionism or anywhere else. Second way of explaining emergence is nature, that emergence exists. It is not that what we call emergence today is unexplained reductionism, but emergence exists and therefore it's a property of nature. That is second answer. Our third answer is God has put it there. So there are three ways of dealing with deeper aspects of emergence. In psychoanalysis, we see emergence in certain parts. The transition from instinct into drives. The transition from fantasy into thought. The transition from survival to pleasure, the transition from ordinary survival and pleasure to self-sacrifice. All these are points where we can discuss the concept of emergence. So, from body to the mind, from individual to society, this also is an emergence, which usually psychoanalysis does not deal with, but it's there. From individual to society, from individual to history, from individual to evolution, from individual and reincarnation. All those are points where some sort of emergence can be at play, and we can see a break of linearity, the reductionist linearity. In Western thought and philosophy, reductionism and emergence both have their schools. We can see even in psychoanalysis, there is a group of Kleinians who would not believe that thought is rooted biologically. There would be a group of Jungians who don't believe that thought is rooted biologically, and both these groups believe in the concept of emergence. Hindu spirituality, of course, is very open to the idea of emergence. Strict Freudians, some of the strict Beyondians would look forward to reductionism. Where it takes us is, if we try to link up the model of the mind of the individual to the construction of the universe, the ideas of emergence will take us there. If they can take us there, if we wish to. And in Hindu psychospirituality, they do take us there. The model of the mind of the individual and the model of the reality, they are together. And this has very profound implications on the constitution of the human mind. How much of it can be explained by reductionism? How much of it can be explained by emergence? At what points do we have to consider emergence? Are we looking at a multi-zone, multi-reductionism system? Or are we just looking at a single linear reductionist system? And where does the input of the outside come into emergence, and where does the input from the outside come into the reductionist system, reductionist process? And this, of course, has very profound implications for model of the mind. And naturally, if the model of the mind changes, it will change pathogenesis, and if pathogenesis changes, it will change the healing technique. This is a function of this, and this is a function of this. Let us now bring in the concept of design and purpose into the discussion of reductionism and emergence. Both reductionism and emergence can be explained in association with inherent design in nature or without an inherent design in nature. Both can be explained in association with a purpose or without a purpose. There can be reductionism without a purpose, there can be emergence without a purpose, or both of them can be with a purpose, or both of them can coexist and complement each other for a purpose. So the concept of purpose and the concept of design you can have a materialist design, a materialist determinism without any purpose the way we understand purpose humanly. Or there can be a system where there is determinism and emergence both with a purpose as we understand in human terms. One of the difficulties that psychoanalysis is terrified of is the concept of design and purpose. And therefore, except for Jung, nobody dares to go there. The whole idea of design and the idea of purpose. Because both will put a limit on the freedom of impulse and the hedonistic underpinnings of psychoanalysis. If we accept the design, the idea of design, you can have different types of arguments. One, there is a linear design. There is a cyclical design. So let's say we bring the idea of design to culture. One can say there is a linear march of culture. So from conservatism, we will move towards liberalism and then it will be there forever. Or there can be a cyclical design of culture where there are cycles of liberalism and conservatism. Or we say there is no such design, it is human will which creates the design. Or we can say there is circumscribed design. There is partial design and partial human will. The design element may be the majority element, but still there is a free zone of human will. Or we may be living in a multiverse and there may be universe-specific design. And when we bring the element of design from philosophy into psychoanalysis, we have three components to chew on. The Jungian concepts, Jung believes very clearly in the program of life, and therefore there is an element of design, there is an element of purpose. Erikson believes in the program of life in his own way. Logotherapy believes in the concept of design. Maslow believes in the concept of design. Evolutionary psychology believes in the concept of design. Hindu spirituality, of course, very clearly believes in the concept of karma, design, and purpose. So conceptually and in practice, the technique, usually we practice psychoanalysis as if there is no validity to the concept of design and purpose. But the moment we give respect to the concept of design and purpose and start factoring it in, both these concepts, in concept and technique, psychoanalysis widens, becomes plural, and undergoes radical changes. How do we look at psychoanalysis and Hindu spirituality in the context of reductionism, emergence, and design and purpose? Hindu spirituality essentially tries to combine concepts which are seen as mutually exclusive or opposites. The psychoanalytic thinking, which is based upon a Brahmanical thinking, essentially is a very singularist thinking. It's a digital thinking. I call it or thinking, either this or this. The Hindu psychospirituality essentially is an and thinking, this and this. It's a pluralist thinking. So the Hindu psychospirituality tries to combine design and free will. Both have some space. In different contexts, different things prevail. Between the material universe and the universe of ideas and the soul. Between materialism and idealism. Between design in history and individual genius. I'm reminded of Thomas Hardy, who says history, universal history, is at the bottom, autobiography of a few great individuals. Partly it is accepted, not fully. So there is a design in history and there is an element of individual genius. There is the journey of self and karma, and there is a holistic approach to pathogenesis, healing, and self-development. So these are elements where the Hindu psycho-spiritual approach tries to create a more comprehensive and holistic conceptual and practice arcade. So this is something from which we can enrich psychoanalysis, even as we remain anchored in psychoanalysis. What happens if we do it? We radically change model of the mind. We change the conceptual way in which we understand and classify the environment. We alter pathogenesis, healing technique, and we integrate schools of psychoanalysis and schools of psychoanalysis with Eastern schools. All of this can be done. The integrative approach can give us a much wider canvas, much richer landscape of understanding human mind, human suffering, and healing. Thank you.